Okay, great. I have 12 o'clock, and if you have any issues with connecting, please enter those in the chat box and we will deal with those. But it appears everyone's able to hear well, so that's great. I would like to welcome you today to today's webinar. I'm Ken Larimore, Community and Economic Development Educator with the University of Illinois Extension. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available for review on the Extension's Local Government Education, LGE, website. Today, we will take a look at the State of Illinois Consolidation and Unfunded Mandates Task Force recommendations and resource sharing efforts already underway across Illinois. This program was made possible through the University of Illinois Extension, which provides equal opportunities in programs and employment. If you need a reasonable accommodation to participate in this program, please contact your local extension office. To ensure the best quality in our recording, microphones will be muted during the presentation. We do, however, encourage you to add questions in the chat space. If you have any problems connecting, add those as well. The presenter can view your comments and will be able to respond. As a University of Illinois Extension program, it is important that local government education team receive feedback from you for not only today's program, but also for future programs. An email survey will be sent to you at 1 p.m. today, and we ask that each of you complete the survey. Thank you very much. And today, our first speaker will be Norman Walser, a senior research scholar in the Center for Government Studies at Northern Illinois University. He is Director Emeritus of the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs, Western Illinois University, and contributes to professional local economic development literature, including entrepreneurship, government structure, and public finance, and financing creative enterprises. He recently edited research volumes on innovative community change practices, on community visioning, and collective impact practices as applied to community development issues. Norm is currently researching best practices in community-supported businesses by a grant from the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. He also serves on state and local government boards and commissions, including the Governor's Rural Affairs Council, Rural Partners, and the Rural State Policy Panel. Our second guest speaker today is Brian Costin. Brian is the Policy Director in the Office of the Lieutenant Governor Evelyn Sanguinetti. Previously, he worked for the Illinois Policy Institute as the Director of Government Reform, working on government transparency, ethics, and corruption fighting. And he won the 2010 Government Watchdog Award from the Sam Adams Alliance for his work exposing government waste and fraud in Schaumburg, Illinois. So at this time, I would like to welcome our speakers and guests and turn the program over to our first speaker, Norm Walser. Welcome, Norm.
Hi. Thanks very much, Ken, for the introduction and for you and Pam for putting this program together. It's really kind of exciting in many respects. I've been working on local government for a long time in the state, and I think we're really in a situation now where we really almost have to make a difference in some cases, so maybe that's the good news, as painful as it might be. But I think it was particularly interesting to work with the task force on this project because the attitude really was sort of an enabling attitude, the idea of how do we enable local officials and or residents to be able to modernize their governmental structure to meet the changing needs. And as we go into this presentation, keep thinking a little bit about population changes, what's happened with industry. Illinois is very different now, obviously, than it was when many of the governmental structures, or the governments actually, were created. So there comes a time every now and then when there have to be adjustments made in the way we deliver services and the kind of things we do. We need to in some way incorporate technology, but just to basically provide and deliver services as efficiently as possible, and to do it in ways that make the best advantage of the kind of resources we have. So that's pretty much my background on coming into this. My section will basically talk about how the task force worked, what the kind of things we did, procedures we did to take input from the residents and local governments. I wanted to then talk a little bit about what the issues really were that arose, and then turn it over to Brian, who basically headed up operationally the task force, and he can talk about the results, the implementation plans, and these kinds of things. So let's just begin with some slides here. First of all, the task force, essentially our role in it, the Center for Governmental Studies was asked in August of 2015 to come on and assist and to provide some data analysis. And the rationale was that we were to be an independent voice, that it was not something that was, we had no real skin in the game, so to speak. And so we could provide an objective view. We had an opportunity to research what's going on in other states. And so essentially we provided the kind of things that I think an outside agency pretty much can do. So our tasks really involved analyzing the structure of governments, look at how we compare with other states, figure out why we have some fragmentation issues we do, and you'll know already, and you'll learn as we go through this report. But Illinois for a long time has had the highest number of governmental units, and there are some reasons for that. A second thing we wanted to do was to identify the burdensome mandates and what kind of alternatives there might be to provide the services in different ways. All of this was really based on input from taxpayers and public officials. And then the third major role that we tried to play was to gather information on what really good things are happening in terms of cost-saving arrangements and how collaborations have worked. And I was really happily surprised. There are a lot of excellent cost-saving arrangements in play that people really don't know about. And governments are in fact working with each other and with different groups in some very positive ways. And as we'll talk later, and as Brian can talk, we are hopefully we can get some of that word out to the people that might be interested in trying same sort of approaches. And then finally, we tried to assist in some way in making some recommendations, things that we could find that seemed like they might make some sense. But our role really was not to decide on recommendations or vote on them or anything like that. That was clearly the task force members. So to begin, a little bit of rationale very quickly on why we might be interested in this kind of a situation. Well, if you look at the cost of government, and the operating expenditures per capita are probably the best measure of how much it's costing for the government services that we get. And Illinois turns out to have had an almost 24% increase between 1992 and 2012 in constant dollars. So after inflation is removed, we're talking about almost a 24% increase on this is expenditures per capita. And you compare that with Indiana and Wisconsin, and we read a lot in the paper about Illinois losing population and just some businesses and these kinds of things. So the rate of increase in Indiana was about 13%, and Wisconsin was about 17 or 18%. So our two bordering states essentially are rising at a much lower rate. I'm not sure about Iowa. We did not look at that in enough detail, but so it's kind of an anomaly. But even comparable states like Michigan or Texas were basically still leading the pack. So we kind of started with that data and said, okay, so what might be contributing to that? Well, in the next slide, we've just tabulated or presented the number of governments in the state of Illinois. And this is kind of interesting because this was basically 2012 based on the census of governments. And these are independent governments, and so they don't necessarily involve some governments that are reporting through other governments. But the census of governments said that we had 6,963 governments. The Comptroller's Office, which has a count of the legal entities, they reported about 8,480. Since that time, they have found another group of governments that are, they didn't know existed, hadn't reported or whatever. So the number now is closer to 8,516. Now, if the truth is told, we don't really know how many units of government we have when we're thinking of the independent agencies and the ones that are, clearly operating. Not all of them have taxing powers and various things. But the point is we just really don't know a complete number. And we're working on that a little bit now at the center here, and we're working with the State Board of Elections and some others to try to see if we can get a closer count on that. But by comparison, if you looked at comparable data, and these are independent governments from the Census of Governments, Texas came in at 5,147, Pennsylvania 4,897, contiguous states or nearby states 2,700 in Indiana, 3,100 in Wisconsin, and 1,900 in Iowa. So in terms of a comparison, there's some relationship between the numbers of governments that you have trying to deliver services and the cost increases of government. So to take this a step further, and this slide maybe didn't come across quite as clearly on the screen, but I think basically what areas you're in and the counties. But the darker colors here are the ones that have higher density of governments, namely the number of governments per 10,000. Now, having said that, that's affected very much by the size of your area. So that if you have a small county and you have a threshold size to be able to effectively operate a sheriff's department or some other agency, then you're going to have a higher ratio of governments per 10,000. So you want to look at this understanding that population differences will make a difference and other kinds of things. And as we talk about changes, when we're talking about the number of governments per 10,000 residents, if the number of residents goes down and if the number of governments doesn't go down, and it's difficult to eliminate a government, and you couldn't do it if you just lost a few residents, but that ratio can be affected by population change and these kinds of characteristics. But this gives you a kind of a snapshot of where Illinois stands, what the distribution is, and the darkest areas tend to be in the western part, the eastern part. Chicago, the metropolitan area, tends to have less density, mainly because they have more people. So the next step we looked at was property tax as a percentage of income. And this is, one measure of the financing of local governments and how the distribution of the burden is basically shared. And property tax as a percentage of income can be a function of a number of things. If you have fewer state dollars coming in from the state government, for example, then you will have bigger burden on the local residents, and you end up with a higher property tax as a percentage of income. But in this particular point or slide, I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is the property taxes as a percentage of income will be a function of the types of services that are delivered. So you may find that in southern Illinois, in rural areas, there are fewer services than there might be in the metropolitan area of Chicago. But the highest property taxes as a percentage of income are in the dark blue areas. So you can see the northern part of the state, a little bit in the middle, and these kinds of things. Now, it turns out that Illinois notoriously has had relatively high effective tax rates. In the year 2013, Illinois was second among the states in terms of the effective property tax per residential property. The newer numbers came out a month or two ago. We dropped to third, but that's probably not much of an accomplishment for most taxpayers. So we're still running, second or third in the state on property tax, effective property tax rates. And that's basically the property tax as a percentage of the market value of a residential property. So it's just a percentage of your house. So if your house was worth $100,000, then what this is suggesting is you're paying $2,000 in taxes. Another one that's not on the slide, but I think it's kind of interesting, is the state and local taxes as a percentage of personal income. So state and local taxes combined as a percentage of income. Illinois, when the newer numbers came out a few months ago for 2012, the most recent numbers, we actually are fourth among states. So this is something that's kind of serious. And these are kind of states are kind of clustered together around here, so you can move a lot of ranks. But but basically we're number 4 there, and we're number 3 on effective property taxes. If you look at the local tax collections per capita, we're number 8. So anything you look at, the tax burden within the state is relatively high. And as we learned earlier from the expenditures per capita, it's increased pretty substantially. One thing here that's kind of important to think about too is that when you have more special districts that have fewer revenue options available, and you create additional special districts, you're likely to put a direct burden on the property tax because they can't collect sales tax, they can't do other things. But there are some districts that essentially will have other sources and maybe don't even use the property tax, but we'll talk about that in a second. So I wanted just to share with you a little bit about what does the spatial pattern look like for special districts, again, per 10,000 residents. So all the things I talked about earlier, where you have larger areas, they're going to look different than where you have smaller or less populated areas. But I think this is just, to have you understand what's what's going on. So the darker green in this slide is going to be relatively more special districts per 10,000 residents. And so you're seeing in the middle part of the state on the eastern side, we're seeing a kind of a group there that's clustered together. A little bit here and there of some western part of the state and things. But by and large, this is pretty much what the pattern of special districts would look like. Now, in this map, we did not include school districts because school districts are pretty much going to be everywhere. And you do have some places that have relatively more school districts, but we wanted to kind of focus our attention on just what the special districts are, because special districts are the ones really that have been increasing, and the school districts actually have been declining as far as numbers, and mainly driven by the fact that we have fewer students to teach or something like that, and they're likely probably in the future to drop even more. We then looked a little bit between 2007 and 2012 at the change in the number of special districts. So this is just to give you some sense of what the growth really has been. And again, the darker numbers are the ones where the number, this is the absolute number now, it's not a percentage, but it's the absolute number of districts. So the growth really has been over in the eastern part of the state, the middle, down a little bit in the south central area. The less growth on just the numbers has actually been in the suburbs. So this will give you just some sense, again, excluding school districts. Now, had we included school districts in here, then there would have been a significant drop in a number of places because we've come down significantly in terms of the number of districts. So this is really just a 5-year window, and we just wanted to have something to give you a sense of kind of how things are changing. Now, the second part of the task force responsibility, and I think where maybe some of the most important work really has been, is the idea of the unfunded mandates. And Illinois has had a pretty serious history for quite a while, actually, of the General Assembly mandating programs or having local governments take on new responsibilities, but not providing the money to do it. Well, the result of that is, of course, you have to raise the money somewhere. So this is likely to end up at some point on your property tax bill. So the Municipal League put this chart together for the task force. And what they found between 1982 and 2014, there were 266 new unfunded mandates. And these aren't mandates that they should have done anyhow. These were mandates that fell over and above the kind of natural kind of good management kind of things you do. Not that they were all bad or anything like that, but it's just the idea that there are additional things that have to be done, and in fact, funds weren't provided to do them. The school districts came up with a similar kind of estimate, and in their case, they suggested that there were 145 mandates between 1992 and 2014 that were in fact unfunded. So what you have is a situation where, and again, the second part of the task force, where the task force charge really was to figure out, are there better ways to collaborate and to share resources, and do we really need as many units of government as we have? But then the second part of it was, are there some things that the General Assembly is imposing on, as far as responsibilities, that in fact maybe should have been funded or could have been funded, or we wish they would have funded. But it's the idea that mandates are being evaluated. Now, that's kind of important because as we talk in just a minute about how we collected data, we really wanted to get the best information from the people who are working with these mandates every day. So what you're seeing here is just kind of a statewide view, and this is probably, if you redid it, you could probably find other mandates or whatever, but this is a pretty clean estimate of what we're talking about over the last 20 years. So the approaches of the task force, there were several principles that they set up, and it has to be a locally driven initiative. So they really wanted the local officials to be telling them what was needed, how to do it, these kinds of things. This was clearly not a top-down kind of approach. And frankly, if it had been, I probably wouldn't have been interested in working on it. But it's essentially, we had to figure out from the local officials what kind of issues would work, how they could be implemented, and these kinds of things. The second major role of the task force was to reduce obstacles for either reducing the number of governments or changing them or whatever we needed to do to modernize the delivery system, and also to inform the local officials about the potential that was out there for doing things in better ways. So in that respect, they had testimony, the task force had testimony from various groups that are kind of leading the cause in their areas to improve the quality of government and modernize it and so forth. So that it really was all the way through. It was kind of a locally driven and locally informed kind of process. The third thing that was important then was, after this information was compiled, was to in some way introduce legislation to remove some of these obstacles. And that's the process that Brian has led and is ongoing now. And legislation has been submitted that he can talk about. But in addition to that, there was a recognition, I think, on the task force. And remember that the task force was bipartisan. It had local public officials. It had lay resident or regular residents. And so it really was a pretty broad group of 24 or 25 people who participated in this. And I had several comments as we went through here from people on the task force who had been on previous task force, and they remarked that they felt that it was really a hardworking, committed kind of group, and it ran for about a year. So they did a great deal in about a year, and at the end we had something like a 400-page report. And part of the role of the center was to help promote some best practices, and that's what we're kind of getting into now. We're trying to collect some information on what's going on, what's succeeding, and all of that. So in terms of their data collection, the Lieutenant Governor's office had this open portal so anybody could submit ideas. She traveled around the state on other business as well, but discussed mandates in all 102 counties. The task force heard testimony at 16 meetings around the state, which it held. We, as a independent third party, we tried to design a questionnaire, or did design a questionnaire, for local government associations to gather information. So our role really here was to design a comparable questionnaire, design a survey monkey kind of approach, and as a result of that, the cities, counties, townships, school districts, community colleges, fire protection park districts, when they sent it out, we ended up with 500 responses from local officials across the state. Now, that isn't necessarily 500 governments, but we may have had, more than one local official in one government report. But by and large, there were very few cases where there were a large number of local officials reporting from a single government. Our role then was to independently tabulate the results. We sent the results back to the associations, like the Municipal League and the counties and the townships, for their review, and then they submitted what they considered to be suitable adjustments, either for better working relations or organizational changes or getting rid of mandates or doing things in different ways. So in reviewing that, after reviewing that, the task force then it actually received as many as 85 recommendations. So there was a lot of things came in. Now, some of those recommendations were duplicative, and so they distilled them, and then the task force members voted on 27 of the recommendations to submit to the General Assembly at this time. It doesn't mean that the rest of them are all dead. It just means that they could only submit so many at a time and try to get something done. So they're still active consideration, but so basically that's what's gone on at this point. Now, the next steps, essentially, legislation is being introduced or has been introduced. And again, it was bipartisan recommendations. There was not unanimous agreement on every recommendation that went in, and that's what you would expect. We're trying to document best practices and cost savings, and the Center for Governmental Studies is trying to work on some of that. We're trying to work with local governments and inform local governments about ways to collaborate. We'd like to be able to figure out best practices that have been used, what the cost savings were, how it worked, why it worked, those kind of things. And then finally, the task force, the Lieutenant Governor's office, and we as well, will try to monitor some outcomes and then share the results with everybody else. So that pretty much covers my section. I would say that just in kind of wrapping this together, I think when having looked at private sector and public sector decision making in a number of different ways, I sort of decide they have permission to move ahead. I think what the task force has done, in addition to putting together some excellent material, I think what they've really done is raise the level of discussion to where people across the state, local officials, residents, taxpayers, whoever, basically now have permission to start talking about this stuff. Permission in the typical sense, but they can start talking about these things in a legitimate way, and they can kind of move ahead. So I think I would just end with that discussion, and Brian will take over and talk about what happened with the results and where things are at the moment. Brian?
Thank you, Norm. And before we get into my presentation, I just wanted to thank the University of Illinois for putting this on today. I hope to get lots of questions. I see there's a question from Union County here. How were the counties notified about this portal and these meetings? This is the first I'm hearing of this. We did work a lot with the associations to get word out about this. The surveys that Norm talked about were distributed with the associations, and it was something that we got a very good response of, and obviously not everyone was on that email and got notified of it, but hopefully we got a very good representation of local governments from the state, from lots of different types of local governments. And we're continuing to get feedback, so if you feel like there's something to contribute, we're always an open door, and we want to hear more about what's going on. So here we go. I see the slide is up now. So to take a little bit in regards to what came out of the task force. So we had 27 different recommendations that came out of the task force, and we made those 27 recommendations. Not all of them were recommendations that came out in bill form. Some of them were things that could be done administratively, or things that could be done locally. But we did come out with a legislative agenda of 11 different bills, and I'm going to walk through each one of those bills to kind of give you an idea of what we did, and also to give you, the opportunity, if these are things that you support, that you can make your voice heard with your local state elected officials. I think that's really a key in order to get change on both consolidation and unfunded mandates, that the local governments especially need to be giving feedback to their state representatives and state senators. But a little bit first on what our philosophy was is how can we empower citizens and local officials to make local government more efficient and effective. That's kind of one of the goals of the task force. One of the things that we found out very early on is that it's very easy to create a local government, and it is usually very hard to consolidate a local government. So it kind of, for a long time in the state of Illinois, has been mostly a one-way street. There are some exceptions to that. Norm mentioned earlier that there has been some consolidations of school districts that have been primarily driven by population concerns, student enrollment concerns, and also there's been state subsidies to help facilitate that. One of the things that we saw is, like, from level to level of local governments, there's very different rules on how citizens or elected officials in local governments can consolidate. For example, it's relatively easy to consolidate or get the process started to consolidate for school districts, where literally citizens only need 50 signatures from both districts to initiate that process. On the other hand, if you wanted to consolidate townships, it is very, very hard. You would have to get something like 8 or 10% of the registered voters in each township in a county, and if you didn't get one, then you couldn't put it on the ballot, and you had to do so in a very short time frame. So that's one of the things that we identified, and also how can we encourage local governments to work together, share services, and be more efficient. So this is an area where there's a lot of success stories across the state, and we want to encourage more of that. So in regards to reform, we wanted to stop the problem from getting worse. Last year, there was a 4-year moratorium that was enacted by the legislature to not create any new units of local government. Empower citizens to consolidate. We'll get in a little bit more into that in just a minute. And incentivize consolidation and shared services, and eliminate technical obstacles to consolidation. One of the first bills that we talked about in the task force was the Citizens Empowerment Act. So like I said, there's a lot of different rules in regards to consolidation. We wanted to make a method that kind of applied to all different types of local government in Illinois, and basically allows any level of local government to be consolidated into another local government, and give citizens that are empowering citizens was a really big theme of the task force. So we want citizens to be able to control or determine the form and function of their local government. They should have that right. So that's what we did with this act. It really didn't progress out of the committee stage this year, but it is something that we're looking at going forward. This next proposal, however, has got a lot of progress on it. Expand DuPage County's pilot consolidation program to all 102 counties in the state. So about 3 or 4 years ago, I think it's 4 years ago, the state kind of did a pilot project for DuPage County. Only DuPage County was the only one that could exercise this power, but if there was local units of government which their officials were not elected, but rather appointed by the county board or the county executive, that those types of local governments could be consolidated. This includes paper districts, street lighting districts, very small districts that could be considered paper districts, where they contract all their businesses or contract all their services out to businesses or other local governments. And so the idea, this has been popping up numerous times in recent years, but this year it passed the HB 4501. Just earlier this week was voted on with very significant numbers of support out of the House, and it's now in the Senate. The next bill kind of combines a couple of ideas of the task force, where one interesting fact that we found in the research process was that Illinois is a real outlier when it comes to general purpose local government. 40 states in Illinois only have 2 layers or less of general purpose local government. When I say general purpose in Illinois, that means counties, townships, or municipalities. So other states, 40 other states, only 2 layers or less. There's 10 states that have 3 layers, but Illinois is the only state where more than 50% of our residents have 3 layers. So we're an outlier. We're the only one in that regards. So we wanted to look at, and we had residents and different groups from across the state come and tell us, hey, you know what, the rules to consolidating townships are very, very hard. Let's address some of those. So there's a limitation capping the township size at 126 square miles. Also, county boards that have looked into consolidating townships into the county, they realize the state law would say, okay, well, now you have to change your form of government on the county level into commission form. You can't, which means that you either have like 3 or 5 county elected officials. They have their areas of responsibility. It's very different than having in what happens in the other counties where you have maybe 20 different board members. And then another thing is that when consolidation happens, a lot of times two townships, they have 2 different property tax rates. When they consolidate, what would happen is that the property tax rate would go up in one township, and the other one it would go down. So we wanted to create a mechanism where they can hold the tax rates so that it wouldn't harm either of the residents of the township. And so there's been various efforts across the state. McHenry County, the citizens group there has been pursuing township consolidation very actively, and that's one of the reasons why we did that. And this is the next measure is in regards to assessments, and we had a township assessor who was on our task force, Warren Dixon from DuPage County, Naperville, who observed that in a lot of counties with lower populations, that there's a real difficulty in finding qualified township assessors. And so looking at some other states and taking some of their best practices, this measure would allow counties with fewer than 15,000 parcels and $1 billion in EAV to dissolve all of the elected township assessors into a newly elected county assessor position in office. And the goal here is, yes, cost savings, but it's also to professionalize the assessment services in these, in a lot of cases, rural counties. The next measure is it's also kind of an economies of scale, cost savings recommendation based on testimony provided from highway township commissioners. They identified that when there's very few miles of road for a township to maintain, that often it results in higher costs to the taxpayers. And this would allow a township board to consolidate that road and bridge district into the township if this was an issue that they locally identified as something being of interest. Something to report in Naperville, again, they are actively pursuing right now a consolidation between the Township Highway District and the municipality through an intergovernmental agreement, and they estimate that it could save them up to $600,000 per year. Kind of closely related to this, but another part of that same bill. Next up, you may have heard of Evanston Township consolidating into the city of Evanston. They were coterminous before the township was consolidated, and coterminous means that they share the same borders. And so there's 19 remaining coterminous municipalities and townships across the state, and it would be extending that proposal that was kind of a standalone piece of legislation that allowed Evanston to address that issue to the 19 other townships and municipalities across the state. This bill has had some progress, and it's in different forms. There's other bills in addition to this, and there might be some action on this year. We will see. That's the consolidation issue, and on the consolidation issue, there seems to be a lot of bipartisan support for it. A lot of legislators from both parties. On the unfunded mandate reform side of things, there's less bipartisanship, but the issue is definitely something through the survey that NORM and NIU did. A lot of local governments are really interested in this area of unfunded mandates reform. So one of the things that passed out of committee this year is to modernize public notice mandates. Representative Demers' bill passed out of a House committee unanimously. It does not look like it'll be voted by the full House, but we should know by the end of the week. And so there's some interesting rules. Obviously, the technology has changed over time. More and more people get their information from the internet, while less and less people get their information from the newspapers. And so what should be done is transparency is a very important goal of government, to inform citizens, but we should be taking advantage of the newer technologies that give access to more people that important public information. So local governments, a very big cost for local governments is publishing notices in the newspaper, but if they have a website and they post the information online, they should get relief from that. It has more eyeballs on the internet rather than newspapers. It's up there 24 hours a day rather than having to catch the newspaper on any particular day. Another issue was, and this is a big expense for counties in particular, local governments are forced to mail tax assessment notices to residents and businesses. They also, in many cases, post them online. They also mail these notices out to people. A lot of costs incurred by all those different public notice requirements. This bill says if you post it online and you mail it, then you shouldn't have to also publish it in the newspaper. And then, there's still antiquated laws that require local governments to maintain information in microfiche or microfilm, and that should be updated to modern technologies. The next one is in relation to school districts in particular, third-party contracting, physical ed, and driver's ed, giving local governments more control over these areas so that they can either save money or deliver services in a different way that's better for their students. The first one is third-party contracting relief. Now, in 2009, I believe, there was a change in the law that said if you're going to contract out non-instructional services types of business, you would not be able to compete on price. You would have to have whatever company that bid on the project, they would have to offer a comparable compensation package as whatever was most likely collectively bargained on the local level. So that it would eliminate price competition. And so this would reform that and say, once again, school districts for non-instructional service could shop around to try to get the best price for their taxpayers and be able to put that money that they save back into the classroom. Next up is physical education mandate relief, and so Illinois has some of the highest standards in the nation, and really importantly, there isn't a lot of flexibility for an individual student. So say if you're a student who does athletics after school or outside of school, and you get that appropriate fitness activities, and you would still be required right now to engage in PE class instead of having the flexibility to potentially take a study hall or another course that might be able to help you out academically. And so what we want to do here is to give local governments the ability to find out what the appropriate education plan is for the individual students and give them local control over that process. Next up is driver's education mandate relief. There are a lot of private providers of driver education that have to go through all the same standards with the Secretary of State and making sure that they're qualified and trained properly. But it's also a big cost a lot of times for school districts to have these people on their staff. So giving school districts more flexibility in regards to driver's ed so that they could potentially save money. Another issue that comes up for a lot of municipal and fire protection districts is minimum manning. Right in recent years, there's been some legislation passed on the state level that says manning levels can be a part of collective bargaining. And in interest arbitration, the arbitrator can force a manning requirement on those local governments and take away that local control to be able to determine their own manning levels. There's a lot of things that are going on, trends across the country, where a lot of different places are shifting from having a lot of firefighters to having more of an emergency service response, paramedics, that type of thing on staff because fire calls are dropping. There's been improvements in regards to MABUS and communities working together so that they can have other communities on call if there's a very bad day. The other issue, I'll go back a slide here, is PSEBA. So this is the Public Safety Employee Benefits Act. In the state of Illinois, the legislature has not defined what a catastrophic injury, which would require a local government to pay out lifetime health insurance benefits, etc., and defining catastrophic injury so that if you can find gainful employment and your injuries do not prevent you from that, that would be the definition, the same definition as on the federal level that local governments could use, and it would help save some of those rapidly growing costs on local government. Next up is financial parameters and interest arbitration. So in interest arbitration right now, what we've seen across the state is that arbitrators have been making decisions on collective bargaining agreements without respect to a local government's ability to pay. So it has been forcing very difficult situations on local government where an arbitrator makes a decision on a contract and the local government might not be able to pay for it, and they have to do one of two things in those scenarios. Maybe they'll have to cut services elsewhere, or they'll be forced to raise taxes in some way to pay the costs of that collective bargaining agreement. So this would require arbitrators to take into account the existing financial parameters of a local government during the interest arbitration, something that's already afforded to Chicago Public Schools, but extending that to the rest of the state. Next up is economic feasibility exemption and annual review of unfunded mandates. So having local governments they have the best idea of what is their core mission that they're trying to provide on the local level, and giving them an additional process to exempt themselves out of certain categories of unfunded mandates will help them better concentrate their resources on their core missions. As Norm stated earlier, the growth in unfunded mandates in the state of Illinois has been huge over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And it's big government telling little government what they have to do without giving them the resources to do it. And so there needs to be a mechanism to allow local governments to have more control. The other part of this bill is the annual review of unfunded mandates. A long time ago, DCEO did kind of a one-time review of unfunded mandates, and they also have kind of an annual review, but there's some big shortcomings. It's called the State Mandates Catalog, but they don't really, one of the big issues is that they don't calculate what these unfunded mandates end up costing local governments across the state of Illinois. And so we think that there should be more done so that the state can give legislators and local governments kind of a statewide estimate of what these individual unfunded mandates cost them. And we think that that's going to help empower legislators to make better decisions about these unfunded mandates, and hopefully use that to say, okay, well, we need to change this mandate. It costs too much and the benefit's not enough. So let's reform this, repeal this, revise it, whatever it might be. But to have that information is really, really important. Next slide is, this talks about the unfunded mandates annual review. Another proposal is to give local governments control of employee retirement benefits for new employees. So a lot of mandates in regards to pensions have been imposed on local governments. They've been revised over years. Pension sweeteners that have imposed huge costs on local governments, and they lack the ability to determine what they're, what they can afford, what is appropriate on the local level. So this bill would give more control to local governments for new employees. For example, potentially they can say, okay, for new employees, we want to do Social Security plus a 401k, something that's more standard with the public. So that would be an option for local governments underneath this bill. It's really this is one of the biggest costs for local governments, so it's a critical area to give local governments ability to control some of those costs. And finally, a constitutional amendment on state mandates that would essentially make it harder for the state of Illinois, for the General Assembly to pass mandates on local government by kind of increasing the number of people that have to vote for in the legislature on a specific unfunded mandate in order for it to be enforced. 3/4 is the proposed number in this bill. And basically, those higher vote thresholds, hopefully it would kind of force the legislature to be more cautious and pass less unfunded mandates on the local governments. That's it for my slides. A couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. Norm briefly mentioned this, but kind of developing a website is one of the goals of the Lieutenant Governor Office to really give local governments across the state a best practices website to give them ideas on how to share services or explore consolidation. That's something that we're looking at. So at this time, I know there's been some questions that have been coming in, so I think we're going to open it up to Q&A at this point. Is that correct?
Yes. Thank you, Brian. And yes, there have been some questions. Some of them have been addressed as we've been going along here. I don't know if there are others. Please put any questions you have in the box. We'll get to them. Brian, can you see the couple of the questions there. Maybe you have comments about any of those?
There's a question from Union County. Anything interesting happening in terms of consolidation across counties and not just within? Here, not a whole lot, but here and there, there's some counties that, one example comes to mind. Iroquois and I believe Bond County have a shared health district essentially, and from that there's been some talk about consolidating counties. Hasn't really gotten to a very advanced stage. One of the things that was talked about in regards to multi-counties is the consolidation that has gone on for regional superintendents. I think that they just completed a round of consolidation where I think they went from about, and Norm might be able to jump in here, but 40-some regional boards of education down to 35. And so that has kind of been a across counties type of consolidation, a more regional approach to that. So it is here and there, and it seems like the consolidation momentum has been slowly building in the state of Illinois, and I really hope that that regions start looking at ways to potentially consolidate or to be engaging in things such as shared services in the future.
You mentioned that the dollar amount of unfunded mandates was difficult to nail down. Do you have an estimate of how many there are statewide, and then how many federal unfunded mandates?
Oh boy. There's a lot, and we tried to, with our survey, and Norm can talk a little bit more about this because he worked with the associations. There was an attempt to kind of quantify for the average local government of a particular type, how much does the unfunded mandates cost? So Norm, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we tried pretty hard there, and about the only problem, or the only thing we were able to come up with, was there would be individual cases where, let's say, a city or a county or a township or somebody had basically gone through the effort of calculating locally what is the cost of doing a certain type of action. So they had pretty clean numbers, but there was no way to bring them up to the state level because every local government really is different. They pursued some of the mandates to different degrees, and so there was no real consistent way that we would have any confidence in the statewide estimate. And we checked with some other states, and they had the same problem. And so I don't know that we have anything other than very general numbers, like it's millions or something like that. But I don't think we have anything with any precision that I'd want to put my name on at the moment.
Uh-huh.
I see a question from Ann Silvis. Well, not maybe a question, but a statement. Some counties share services, and you heard about that from Champaign and Peoria counties. Another example of that I'd like to point out. Sangamon County Citizens Efficiency Commission. One of the things that we found statewide is that different levels of local government might not talk to each other. And by getting everyone in a room and talking about some of the shared issues that a lot of different levels of local government are experiencing can be a catalyst to sharing services from across different types of local government, or even looking at joint purchasing types of things, or working together on joint projects. So it's definitely a trend that we want to highlight more in the future with a website that we have planned. So that's a great observation. Thanks, Ann.
And as Pam has entered in the chat box, our upcoming webinar in May 19th, we'll have Dr. Kent Redfield presenting. So it may be an additional interesting topic. So I would like to thank both our great speakers today for presenting this important program. I really appreciate it, and it appears we are right exactly on time. And if there are no other questions, we'll proceed. I'd like to mention the additional government programming on the Extension website, and then the YouTube channel on the screen has previous programs as well. That's is under LGIEN at this point, under YouTube, LGIEN. And please contact your local extension office if needed. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, and contact us anytime.